It starts on Halloween night, 1,981 a night, meant for costumes, candy, and childish laughter. But in Amarillo, Texas, as the sun disappeared behind the flat horizon and the streets emptied, something else crept through the darkness. Something violent. Something that would tear apart a community, shock a nation, and destroy the life of a boy who wasn't even old enough to buy a beer. Inside a quiet convent, Sister Tadea Benz, a 6-year-old nun known for her kindness and devotion, prepared for bed. She had lived a life of faith, charity, and quiet service, the kind of person who seemed untouchable by the horrors of the world. But that night, horror found her. Sometime after midnight, an intruder slipped inside. A struggle followed, brief, brutal, unforgiving. By dawn, Sister Benz was dead. The cause: rape, assault, and strangulation. The community was stunned. A nun murdered in her own convent? It didn't seem real. The pressure on police was immediate, overwhelming, electric. Media stormed the streets. Politicians demanded answers. Citizens demanded a suspect. And within days, Amarillo police delivered one. Johnny Frank Garrett. Age: 17. Poor. Learning disabled. Terrified of authority. And completely unprepared for what came next. Police claimed they had a fingerprint. They claimed they had a confession. They claimed they had the right man. But what they really had was a teenager they could break. Johnny was interrogated for hours alone. Exhausted, confused. He was threatened, manipulated, fed details. Every psychological pressure available was used against him. And when they realized he wasn't giving them what they wanted, they made him sign a confession written for him, filled with words he didn't understand, describing acts he had no knowledge of. The next morning, the headline hit, "Teenager confesses to noon's murder." It didn't matter that he immediately recanted. It didn't matter that his IQ tested borderline impaired. It didn't matter that he had no history of violence. It didn't matter that the timeline didn't fit. It didn't matter that there was another suspect, a man with a violent record, whose fingerprint was found at the scene. The narrative was written. The town wanted blood. And Johnny, scared, poor, without a real defense, became the perfect offering. His trial was fast. His defense was weak. The evidence was thin. The science was flawed. The confession was coerced. But none of that stopped Texas. On the 11th of February 1992, at just 28 years old, Johnny Frank Garrett was strapped to a gurney and prepared for lethal injection. A boy who had spent his teenage years on death row, a child, turned into a condemned man. His last words, spoken through tears and rage, became famous. "I'd like to thank my family for loving me and taking care of me, and the rest of the world can kiss my ass." The needle entered his arm, the chemicals flowed, and Texas declared the case closed. But years later, as new evidence emerged, as DNA revealed contradictions, as the alternate suspect's violent history resurfaced, a horrifying truth began to spread. They may have executed the wrong person, a child, a boy who never had a chance. And the story of Johnny Frank Garrett, a story built on fear, faith, fury, and fatal mistakes, was only beginning. Before his name became synonymous with one of the most heartbreaking wrongful execution cases in Texas, Johnny Frank Garrett was simply a boy trying to survive in a world that seemed determined to break him long before the courts ever did. Born on Christmas Day in 1963, Johnny entered a life marked not by joy or stability, but by trauma, poverty, and abandonment. His childhood was not just hard, it was horrifying. Johnny grew up in a chaotic Amarillo neighborhood where violence and neglect were normal parts of daily life. From as early as 6, he endured relentless abuse, physical, emotional, sexual, inflicted by people who were supposed to protect him. These experiences didn't just scar him. They shaped the way he thought, understood consequences, and interacted with the world. Psychologists later concluded that Johnny had the mental and emotional maturity of a child far younger than his real age. School was no refuge. Johnny struggled to read. He struggled to understand instructions. He struggled to fit in. His IQ tested in the borderline impaired range, and teachers often described him as lost, confused, or easily manipulated. He had learning disabilities that went untreated, emotional wounds that went unaddressed, and a desperate need for safety that never came. Instead of help, he received punishment. Instead of therapy, he received discipline. Instead of support, he was pushed further to the margins. By adolescence, Johnny drifted around Amarillo with no real structure in his life. He sometimes stayed with relatives, sometimes with neighbors, sometimes in foster placements that treated him more as a burden than a child in need. He developed coping mechanisms, common among abused children: dissociation, compliance under pressure, and a willingness to please adults even when it hurt him. These traits, harmless on the surface, would later make him devastatingly vulnerable in the interrogation room. Despite the chaos, those who knew Johnny described him as gentle, shy, goofy, and kind. He loved drawing characters from comic books. He played with neighborhood kids, even into his late teens. He talked to animals. He apologized excessively when he thought he upset someone. He had a softness that made it clear he had never grown into the hardness the world demanded of him. He also struggled with seizures and head injuries caused by childhood abuse conditions that further impaired his understanding of right and wrong, time and sequences, fear and compliance. Doctors later said Johnny exhibited clear signs of trauma-induced developmental damage, yet none of this was ever presented at trial. At age 17, still legally, a minor Johnny's life took the turn that would kill him. When the murder of Sister Tadea Benz shocked Amarillo, police bent under pressure to find someone to blame. They picked Johnny not because he fit the evidence, but because he fit their expectations. Young, poor, mentally delayed, defenseless. The perfect suspect. When officers interrogated him, Johnny's lifelong conditioning made him vulnerable to coercion. He didn't fight back. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He didn't understand his rights. He didn't grasp the gravity of what was happening. Instead, like many abused children confronted by authority, he froze, panicked, and did whatever he thought the adults wanted. They fed him details. They guided his statements. They shaped the confession. The jury would later see a confession he recanted as soon as he was away from them. His court-appointed defense team failed to investigate his childhood, his disabilities, his trauma, or the forensic evidence pointing to another suspect. No expert ever explained his mental state. No one advocated for him. Johnny walked into the courtroom already defeated by a lifetime of people ignoring his suffering. At 17, Johnny Frank Garrett was condemned as a cold-blooded killer. In reality, he was still a boy, wounded, confused, and terrified, a child who had never been given a chance to be safe, let alone grow. His execution at 28 didn't end his story. It exposed the devastating consequences of what happens when a system punishes trauma instead of understanding it. The murder of Sister Tadea Benz on Halloween night, 1981, is one of the darkest and most emotionally charged crimes in Texas history, not only because of the brutality of the act, but because of what followed: a flawed investigation, a rushed prosecution, and the eventual execution of a teenager who, decades later, experts believe may have been completely innocent. To understand the tragedy of this case, we must begin with the victim, the crime that shook Amarillo. Sister Tadea Benz was 76 years old, a beloved Catholic nun living in the St. Francis convent in Amarillo, Texas. She dedicated her life to service, cooking, cleaning, helping the poor, and praying daily. On the 31st of October 1981, she went to bed as usual in her quiet room. But sometime after midnight, horror entered the convent. A man broke in through a small window. He moved silently down the hall. He entered Sister Benz's room. A violent struggle erupted. By dawn, the nun was found dead, raped, strangled, and beaten. She was so frail, and yet the brutality inflicted on her suggested rage or desperation, not the actions of a calculating killer. The murder of a nun, a symbol of innocence, shocked Amarillo like a lightning strike. Politicians demanded swift justice. The media descended. Citizens panicked. Churches filled with mourners. Everyone wanted answers. And police felt the pressure to deliver someone. Anyone. Police, under pressure tunnel vision, begins. Investigators scoured the convent. They dusted for fingerprints. They looked for signs of forced entry. And they found one thing that would haunt this case forever: a partial fingerprint on a TV set belonging to the nuns. But the print did not belong to Johnny Frank Garrett. It belonged to a different man with a history of violence. a man later known as the other suspect. But Amarillo police ignored him. Why? Because just one day after the murder, they thought they found the perfect suspect. A confused, low IQ, 7-year-old boy who lived across the street. His name, Johnny Frank Garrett. The evidence that never existed. Police had absolutely no physical evidence tying Johnny to the crime. No DNA, no fingerprints, no hair, no cement match, no eyewitness, no weapon, no signs he was ever inside the convent. Nothing. The prosecution's case was a house of cards built on one need. A coerced confession full of errors. Johnny's mental age was about 14. He suffered from brain damage, trauma, and developmental disabilities. Under hours of intense interrogation without a lawyer or guardian, he broke. Police fed him details. They told him things only the killer would know. And when he couldn't repeat them correctly, they corrected him on tape. Johnny signed whatever they put in front of him. He recanted immediately afterward. 2-1. A jailhouse informant, later proven to be a liar. He claimed Johnny confessed. Years later, he admitted he lied to reduce his own charges. 3. A prosecutor disparate to show swift justice. The district attorney used religion, fear, and emotion to paint Johnny as a monster, a teenager suddenly capable of vicious rape and murder, despite no history of violence. 4. A community that wanted closure, not truth. Newspapers called the murder satanic. Church leaders demanded accountability. People wanted the Catholic community to feel safe again. Johnny became the sacrifice. The alternate suspect police ignored. The most shocking detail of the case is this. Police had a far more likely suspect from day one. A man named Leoncio Perez Rueda, a.k.a. the Cuban suspect. He lived near the convent, had a record of violence, had multiple sexual assault accusations, had broken into homes before, had fingerprints matching the crime scene, was seen in the area that night, but police dismissed him because he left Amarillo shortly after the murder. He was deported. Case closed conveniently. Later, Rueda confessed to a similar attack in the same town, with the same pattern of behavior and the same forensic signature. But by then, Texas had already built its case against Johnny. A trial, a race toward a conviction. Johnny's trial was not a fair fight. He was represented by an inexperienced court-appointed lawyer who did little investigation and failed to present. Johnny's severe childhood abuse, his brain damage, his mental impairments, the alternate suspect, the fingerprint evidence, the flawed confession, medical inconsistencies in the case. The prosecution weaponized religion, quoting scripture to argue that even God demands death for certain sins. The courtroom was packed with nuns, community members, and angry locals. A jury of older, conservative Amarillo citizens watched as prosecutors described Johnny, a scared, thin teenager, as a violent predator lurking in the night. But the real killer? He wasn't even mentioned. Within hours, the jury reached a verdict. Guilty. Johnny was 17. He was sentenced to death. The bogus confession, the foundation of a lie. Johnny's confession, the backbone of the prosecution's case, was filled with errors that should have cleared him. He got the location of the room wrong. He described the nun's body incorrectly. He misidentified the weapon. He gave the wrong time of death. He said he entered through a door that was locked. He didn't even know the layout of the convent. He didn't know anything about the crime scene until police fed him details. Coercing false confessions from intellectually disabled teens is tragically common. Johnny became one more example. Forensic facts that proved his innocence ignored. After the trial, experts examining the physical evidence found the attacker was an adult male with a large build. Johnny was 5'4", 135 pounds. DNA did not match Johnny, though early testing was limited. Fingerprints on the TV belonged to another man, the alternate suspect. Semen analysis excluded Johnny, but was not shown clearly to the jury. Still, Texas refused to reopen the case. The execution that should never have happened. On the 11th of February 1992, Johnny Frank Garrett was executed by lethal injection. He was frightened, angry, shaking, but still insisting on his innocence until the final moment. His last words were a mixture of pain, love, and frustration. I'd like to thank my family for loving me and taking care of me. And the rest of the world can kiss my ass. For a boy abused his entire life, abandoned by the system, and executed based on lies, his final message was not cruelty. It was heartbreak. Years later, the truth emerges. Decades after Johnny's death, DNA suggested the attacker was not Johnny. The alternate suspect's violent history resurfaced. The jailhouse informant admitted he lied. Experts confirmed Johnny's confession was coerced. Defense lawyers exposed ignored evidence. A documentary, The Last Word, uncovered new details. Johnny's execution is now widely regarded as one of the most obvious wrongful executions in American history. When Johnny Frank Garrett was sentenced to death in 1982, he didn't enter prison as a 17-year-old boy. He entered as a symbol, a target, a name the entire Amarillo community had been told to fear. But behind the image painted by the prosecution lived a child who had never learned how to protect himself, never learned how to fight back, never learned how to say no to adults in authority. Johnny arrived on Texas death row with the mental and emotional development of someone far younger. Guards later admitted he seemed confused, overwhelmed, and terrified. His reading level hovered around that of a fourth grader. He barely understood courtroom procedures. He didn't understand what an appeal truly meant. And he still believed with the innocence of a child that someone, someday, would realize the police had made a mistake and take him home. But death row is not a place for hope. Locked in a 6-by-9-foot cell at the Ellis unit, Johnny spent 23 hours a day in isolation. Concrete walls, iron bars, no physical contact with anyone. The only light came from a buzzing fluorescent bulb overhead, sometimes flickering through the night. For a teenage boy already damaged by childhood trauma, the psychological impact was devastating. Johnny tried to adapt. He drew pictures. He wrote letters to his family, letters filled with misspellings, crossed out words, and childlike expressions of fear and love. In one he wrote, "Mom, I'm scared all the time. I try to be strong, but I don't know how." He talked to other inmates through the vents at night. Some took pity on him. Some teased him. Some warned him that he needed to grow up fast, or death row would eat him alive. But Johnny never grew up in the way they meant. He stayed gentle, emotional, soft-hearted traits that made him even more vulnerable. The mental collapse of a traumatized child. Years passed. Johnny grew physically into adulthood, but emotionally, he remained the same abused boy. Psychiatrists who later reviewed his case found shocking details. He suffered from dissociative episodes. He had signs of PTSD. His IQ was low. He had brain damage from childhood beatings. He was highly susceptible to suggestion. He was unable to understand long-term consequences. These weren't small issues. These were the exact traits that make a person vulnerable to false confessions. Death row intensified everything. The fear, the trauma, the confusion. Johnny experienced night terrors, panic attacks, and long periods of depression. On at least one occasion, guards reported he seemed in a dissociative trance, staring blankly at the wall, whispering prayers under his breath. When asked what he was doing, he said, trying to make it all disappear. But nothing disappeared. Not the walls. Not the sentence. Not the fear. Appeals. A system designed to ignore boys like Johnny. Johnny's automatic appeals process began almost immediately, but the lawyers assigned to him were underfunded, overworked, and unprepared for a capital case involving a teenage defendant. They should have challenged the coerced confession, challenged the reliability of the jailhouse informant, investigated the alternate suspect, presented evidence of Johnny's childhood trauma, presented mental health evaluations, challenged the timeline, questioned the forensic inconsistencies. But they did almost none of that. Files were left untouched. Witnesses were never interviewed. Evidence was ignored. Leads went cold. His defense team even failed to submit psychological assessments showing he was unfit for harsh interrogation. They failed to highlight that Johnny's confession didn't match the crime scene. They failed to expose that the state's star witness, the jailhouse informant, was trying to save himself from his own charges. Worst of all, they failed to present the fingerprint evidence pointing to a completely different suspect. In many ways, Johnny wasn't just fighting the state of Texas. He was fighting the people who were supposed to defend him. The appellate system, where truth goes to die. As Johnny's appeals moved through the courts, the system repeatedly made one thing clear. They did not want to reopen the case. Every motion was denied. Every hearing was rejected. Every plea ignored. Even when evidence emerged that the alternate suspect had committed similar assaults, the confession was likely coerced. Johnny's IQ placed him in the intellectually disabled range. Forensic inconsistencies suggested innocence. The courts responded with the same phrase, procedurally barred, meaning, it doesn't matter if it's true. It matters that you brought it too late. Johnny didn't understand any of this. Court rulings confused him. Legal language overwhelmed him. He once wrote to an attorney, "Why won't they listen? I didn't do it. Why won't they look again?" No one had the heart to tell him the truth. The system didn't care whether he did it, only that he had been convicted. The clemency fight. A race against time. As Johnny grew into his 20s, his lawyers began a desperate fight to save his life. They gathered new evidence. They brought forth experts. They documented his abusive childhood in horrifying detail. They proved he was mentally impaired. They connected the alternate suspect to the crime. For the first time, momentum shifted. Activists protested. Journalists questioned the case. Catholic groups expressed outrage. Amnesty International got involved. Lawyers begged for a governor's review. And for a moment, a brief, fleeting moment, it seemed possible that Texas might reconsider. But then came the final blow. Governor Ann Richards, despite her reputation for fairness, declined to intervene. She was facing political pressure. The climate was harsh. The public still believed Johnny's confession. The Board of Pardons and Paroles voted the same day. Clemency denied. Exécution date confirmed. Johnny's last hope evaporated. The final days of a childhood that never existed. In the days leading up to his execution, Johnny experienced what psychologists call death row syndrome, a collapse of psychological functioning triggered by prolonged isolation and impending death. He cried often. He stopped eating. He wrote frantic letters. He prayed. He begged. He apologized for things he didn't do. He recited Bible verses through tears. He told his priest, "I just want someone to believe me." On the 11th of February 1992, Johnny was led into the Huntsville death chamber, the same place Texas had executed hundreds before him, the same place that would later take the lives of other potentially innocent men like Willingham and DeLuna. He was strapped to the gurney. Witnesses filed in. The warden asked for final words. Johnny's last message was raw, grieving, and unforgettable. "I'd like to thank my family for loving me and taking care of me, and the rest of the world can kiss my ass." A statement not of hatred, but of heartbreak. He closed his eyes. The chemicals flowed. At age 28, Johnny Frank Garrett took his final breath. A teenager for life, killed by the state, for a crime he likely didn't commit. The legacy of Johnny Frank Garrett begins not in the courtroom, not in the death chamber, and not even in the brutal crime he was accused of, but in the haunting aftermath of an execution that many now believe was not just tragic, but unforgivable. Johnny's case lingers like a wound in the American conscience because it represents what happens when fear replaces caution, when prejudice replaces evidence, and when a boy is treated as a monster long before anyone stops to ask if the real monster is the system itself. Johnny was executed at the age of 28, but in truth, he died as the child the world never allowed him to outgrow. His developmental disabilities, trauma, and mental fragility weren't footnotes. They were the central elements that shaped every mistake in this case. His vulnerability made him easy to manipulate. His confusion made him easy to blame. His poverty made him easy to ignore. And his youth made him easy to sacrifice. His legacy forces us to confront a devastating truth. When the justice system wants a conviction more than it wants accuracy, innocence becomes irrelevant. Johnny's case is one of the clearest examples of how wrongful convictions don't just happen, they are created, piece by piece, through a chain of failures. A police force under immense pressure, a coerced confession extracted from a terrified minor, a jury emotionally charged by the death of a beloved nun, prosecutors who ignored contradictory evidence, a defense team too weak to save him, courts unwilling to revisit the facts. But perhaps the darkest part of Johnny's legacy is how unnecessary his execution was. Years later, forensic reviews, witness reevaluations, and investigative documentaries revealed the staggering weaknesses in the case. The coerced confession, the ignored alternate suspect, the unreliable testimony, the misunderstandings caused by Johnny's cognitive impairments. The more people looked, the more the truth came into focus. Johnny Frank Garrett may have been innocent. This possibility, this terrifying, irreversible possibility, transformed his story from a single tragedy into a national symbol of everything that can go wrong in capital punishment. His execution is cited in law schools, innocence conferences, and death penalty debates. It is taught as a case where the system didn't fail accidentally, it failed systemically. Johnny's story became a rallying cry for reform. Advocates for juveniles on death row began using his case to argue that children, especially traumatized, disabled children, do not belong in interrogation rooms alone. Psychologists referenced him in research on false confessions, demonstrating how easily teens can be manipulated into saying what interrogators want. Human rights groups cited him when pushing for limits on capital punishment for intellectually impaired individuals. But his legacy didn't just change conversations, it changed people. Johnny's brother said the execution destroyed his family. The Catholic community, once convinced of Johnny's guilt, later questioned everything when new evidence emerged. Journalists who studied the case reported losing sleep, haunted by the idea that a terrified boy had been executed to protect the illusion of justice. The film The Last Word brought Johnny's voice back into the world, shaky, scared, pleading, forcing viewers to confront the reality of who he truly was. Not a predator, not a monster, but a broken child trying to survive a system designed for adults. And so, the meaning of Johnny Frank Garrett's life does not lie in the accusations against him. It lies in the caution his story demands of us. He represents every defendant who cannot speak for himself, every teen interrogated without a lawyer, every disabled person misunderstood in court, every poor defendant without real defense, every person condemned by fear instead of facts, every innocent life the system is willing to sacrifice to appear strong on crime. Most of all, his story raises the question at the very heart of the death penalty debate. How many more Johnny Frank Garretts have we executed? And how many more will we execute before we admit the system is incapable of perfection? Johnny didn't leave behind a legacy of violence. He left behind a legacy of warning, a reminder carved into the stone of American history, that when the justice system moves too fast, listens too little, and cares too late, it does more than make mistakes. It destroys lives. It destroys families. It destroys truth. And sometimes, it destroys children who never had a chance. In the end, the story of Johnny Frank Garrett doesn't fade quietly into the past. It lingers heavy, unfinished, and unbearably human. Johnny entered the world unwanted, lived a life unprotected, and died in a system uninterested in seeing who he really was. A frightened teenager with the mind of a child, pushed into the center of a storm he never created, convicted for a crime that evidence now suggests he may not have committed. His execution was meant to bring closure, but instead, it opened wounds that have never healed. Every piece of ignored evidence, every inconsistency in the confession, every failure of the courts to reconsider, every warning sign experts raised, all of it now stands as a monument to how devastatingly wrong the system can be when it trades truth for speed, nuance for headlines, and a human life for public reassurance. Johnny's last words, defiant, hurt, trembling, weren't the words of a monster. They were the words of someone who had spent his entire life begging to be believed, begging to be understood, begging to be seen. Even in death, he was still that little boy who never got a chance to grow, to heal, to be anything more than what the system decided he was. And so his story remains a warning, a mirror, a question. How many more innocent boys have we executed? How many confessions were born from fear, not guilt? How many truths were ignored because they were inconvenient? Thank you for watching. If Johnny Frank Garrett's story changed the way you see justice, or made you question the certainty of the system we trust with life and death, share your thoughts below. And join us in the next episode as we continue revealing the cases the world tried to bury and the voices that were silenced before they ever had the chance to speak.